Hey bosses, and welcome back to Boss Economic World. The show where we slice through the jargon, bust the myths, and tell you what's really going on behind the big, scary economic headlines. Alright, let's get into it. The date is November 5th, 2025. And just this week, all eyes were on Shanghai for the annual China International Import Expo. It's basically China's big "we're open for business" party. And the host of the party, Premier Li Chang, got up on stage and dropped a number that had every analyst in the world scrambling for their calculators: 170 trillion yuan. That's the GDP figure he says China will surpass in the next 5 years. For those of you playing at home, that's about $23.9 trillion. He served it up with a smile, telling all the global CEOs in the room that China is still the place to be, a land of golden opportunity. On the surface, it sounds like classic, confident Beijing. Projecting strength, talking up growth. But here at Boss Economic World, we don't just read the teleprompter. We look at the fine print. And when you do, you realize this isn't a story about a confident sprint. It's a story about a frantic, high-stakes battle against an invisible enemy that's threatening to bring the whole house down. So today, we're going to unpack what that 170 trillion yuan number really means. We'll expose the economic ghost that's haunting China, explain Beijing's bizarre-sounding new plan to fight it, that anti-involution campaign, and figure out if China is about to pull off the greatest economic pivot in modern history, or if it's just rearranging the deck chairs on a very, very large ship. Grab your coffee. This is a big one. Okay, 170 trillion yuan by 2030. Premier Li's statement implies an average annual growth of about 4% a year. And your first reaction might be, meh, 4%? The US would be happy with that, but for China? Isn't that a bit slow? For decades, we got used to China posting growth numbers that look like typos: 8%, 10%, even 12%. 4% feels like trading in a Ferrari for a sensible sedan. But here's the first critical twist, and it's a concept you absolutely need to understand: nominal versus real GDP. Think of it like this. Real GDP is what you usually hear about on the news. It's the growth of the actual stuff an economy produces: more cars, more apartments, more bubble tea, with the effect of inflation stripped out. It's the quantity. Nominal GDP is the growth including inflation. It's the total value of everything in today's dollars, or in this case, today's yuan. It's the sticker price of the entire economy. For most of modern history, nominal growth has been higher than real growth because of inflation. If real growth is 2% and inflation is 3%, your nominal growth is a healthy 5%. This is good. Inflation makes debts easier to pay off and gives companies room to raise prices and wages. But in China right now, something spooky is happening. They're on track to hit their real GDP target of around 5% this year. Huzzah! But their nominal GDP growth is actually slower. Let that sink in. The value of everything they're producing is growing slower than the amount of stuff they're producing. How is that possible? One word: deflation. Deflation is the arch-nemesis of any modern economy. It's not just falling prices, which sounds nice if you're a shopper. It's a toxic, corrosive acid that eats away at an economy from the inside out. It is, without exaggeration, an economic zombie apocalypse. Here's how the infection spreads. Stage 1, the waiting game. You want to buy a new car, a new phone, a new apartment. But you hear prices are falling. A brand new EV that was $30,000 last year is $25,000 today. You think, hey, if I wait 6 more months, maybe it'll be $22,000. So, you wait. And so does everyone else. Consumer spending grinds to a halt. Stage 2, the corporate squeeze. Car companies, phone makers, and property developers are now sitting on lots full of unsold stuff. To move it, they have to slash prices even more. Their profit margins evaporate. They were expecting to sell that car for $30,000, but now they're lucky to get $22,000. Stage 3, the debt spiral. Here's where it gets really nasty. The company took out a $1 billion loan to build that factory, based on the assumption they'd be selling cars for $30,000. But now, their revenue is collapsing while their debt stays the same. In real terms, their debt is actually getting bigger. It's like trying to run up a down escalator that's speeding up. This leads to bankruptcies. Just look at the slow-motion implosion of China's property giants like Evergrande and Country Garden over the past few years, a classic symptom. Stage 4, the paycheck hit. With no profits, companies can't give raises. They start cutting wages. Then they start laying people off. Suddenly, even the people who wanted to spend can't, because they're worried about their jobs. This feeds back into stage 1, creating a death spiral. This isn't a hypothetical. It's happening in China right now. Producer prices, the prices factories charge, have been falling for over a year. Consumer prices are hovering near zero or are negative. From electric vehicles to coffee chains like Luckin and Coty waging a 9.9 yuan latte war, a brutal price war has broken out across the economy. So, when Premier Li says he's targeting 4 to 5% nominal growth, he's not just setting a growth target. He's declaring war on deflation. He's saying, we will not allow the sticker price of our economy to stagnate. We will escape this zombie apocalypse. That 4% isn't an ambition, it's a floor. It's the minimum speed they need to keep the plane from falling out of the sky. As one economist, Michelle Lamb, put it, escaping deflation is more important than the raw quantity of growth. So, how do you fight zombies? Beijing's master plan has a name that sounds like it came straight out of a sci-fi movie, the Anti-Involution campaign. To understand anti-involution, you first have to understand involution. It's a sociological term that's become a massive buzzword among young Chinese people. It basically means a competitive rat race where everyone works harder and harder for diminishing returns. It's running faster and faster on a hamster wheel, only to find yourself in the exact same spot, but more exhausted. Think about it, a dozen food delivery companies all promising faster delivery for a lower price, until the drivers are running red lights and the companies are bleeding cash. Or 100 EV startups, all with basically the same technology, undercutting each other into bankruptcy. That is involution, a low-quality, cutthroat cage match that destroys value instead of creating it. The anti-involution campaign is the government stepping in as the referee and saying, enough. Beijing is basically telling industries, stop the suicidal price wars. You are not allowed to engage in abnormal pricing. The Auto Industry Association, under government pressure, even had its major players, from BYD to Tesla, publicly pledge to avoid abnormal pricing and compete fairly. That pledge fell apart almost immediately because it smelled a lot like illegal price fixing, but it shows you the government's intent. The goal is to force companies to compete on quality, on innovation, on brand, not just on who can burn the most cash the fastest. By stamping out excessive competition, they hope firms can restore their pricing power. If a company can sell its car for a decent price, it makes a profit. If it makes a profit, it can invest in R&D for a better car. And most importantly, it has the capacity to give its workers a raise. And that giving workers a raise is the holy grail. Because it's the only sustainable way to solve China's biggest long-term problem and power the next phase of its growth, boosting domestic consumption. But that brings us to the elephant in the room. Or rather, the elephant, the eagle, and the bear all circling the room. For 30 years, China had a simple, world-conquering economic model, be the factory of the world. Make everything cheaper and better than anyone else, and export, export, export. They built the world's most dominant supply chains, and it worked spectacularly. But that model is hitting a very big, very real wall. The US and the EU are tired of what they see as unfair competition. They complain about massive state subsidies that allow Chinese companies to flood global markets with cheap goods, think solar panels a decade ago, and electric vehicles today. The EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism is a thinly veiled shot at China's manufacturing-heavy economy. The US has a web of tariffs and, more importantly, tech export controls designed to kneecap China's advanced industries. The rest of the world is basically saying, China, we love your cheap stuff, but you're exporting your deflation and killing our domestic industries. We can't be your consumer of last resort forever. Premier Li's speech in Shanghai had some not-so-subtle shade for this. He slammed unilateral and protectionist measures that disrupt global trade. He's trying to walk a tightrope, reassure the world that China is a friendly partner while also telling them to back off. Now, the prompt mentions a fictional but plausible event, a trade truce sealed just last week in South Korea between President Trump and President Xi. Let's imagine how that went down. After months of escalating rhetoric, they meet, agree to a temporary pause on new tariffs, and China agrees to buy more American soybeans and natural gas. The US, in return, rolls back a few targeted export controls on less sensitive technology. It's a classic diplomatic de-escalation. It's a handshake for the cameras that lowers the temperature. But nobody should mistake it for a permanent peace treaty. The fundamental conflict is still there. The US and Europe are determined to de-risk from China, which is a polite way of saying they want to rely on it less. This global pushback is forcing Beijing's hand. They've realized they can no longer bet their entire future on the willingness of other countries to buy their products. The old engine is sputtering. They need a new one. And that new engine has to be found at home. This brings us to the grand finale of China's economic strategy, the master plan for the next decade, turning the world's biggest factory into the world's biggest shopping mall. The government is now explicitly saying it needs to form an economic development model driven more by domestic demand and powered by consumption. This is a monumental task. Chinese households are some of the best savers in the world. They save around 30% of their disposable income. American households? They save around 5 to 7%. For decades, the Chinese government encouraged this. High savings funded the massive investments in infrastructure and factories. But now, they need to flip the switch. They need their 1.4 billion citizens to stop stashing cash under the mattress and start swiping their credit cards. Why don't they spend more already? It's not because they don't like nice things. It's because the social safety net is full of holes. People save obsessively for three big fears: a health emergency, their children's education, and their own retirement. This is why another part of the government's new 5-year plan is so crucial, a pledge to significantly increase spending on public services. This is the missing piece of the puzzle. It's the government implicitly saying, we'll build a better healthcare system. We'll make education more affordable. We'll improve pensions. You can feel safe enough to spend a little more of your hard-earned money. If they can pull this off, the potential is staggering. Consumption currently accounts for a little over 50% of China's GDP. In the US, it's nearly 70%. Closing even half of that gap would unleash trillions of dollars in new economic activity growth that doesn't depend on a grumpy trading partner in Washington or Brussels. So, let's bring it all back to that 170 trillion yuan number. It's not a victory lap. It's a battle plan. It's a signal that Beijing is drawing a line in the sand against the deflationary zombie apocalypse. The 4% nominal growth is the baseline for survival. To get there, they're deploying the Anti-Involution campaign, acting as a tough referee to stop self-destructive price wars and help companies become profitable again. And the ultimate goal of that profitability is to fund the wage growth needed to power the Great Pivot, a historic shift away from relying on exports and toward unlocking the spending power of their own 1.4 billion people. Can they do it? This is, without a doubt, one of the most difficult economic transitions any country has ever attempted. It's like trying to rewire the entire electrical system of a skyscraper while the lights are still on. The risks are immense. The Anti-Involution campaign could easily morph into state-sponsored cartels that stifle real innovation and hurt consumers. Shifting deep-seated saving habits could take a generation. And the global environment remains hostile, with the fragile truce with the US likely to be just a temporary reprieve. But China has a track record of pulling off economic miracles. They have the power of a centralized state to mobilize resources on an epic scale. The next 5 years will tell the tale. Will we see a new, more balanced Chinese economy emerge, one that truly does become a massive engine for global growth as a consumer, not just a producer? Or will the deflationary zombies win, dragging the economy into a long, painful stagnation? That 170 trillion yuan isn't a promise. It's a wager. And the whole world has a stake in the outcome. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for tuning in to Boss Economic World. Stay sharp, stay ahead, and don't ever just read the headlines. I'll see you next time.